Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is a new year. It is 2017. Amazing. We made it. No meteor strike, as far as I'm aware, anyway. I haven't checked everywhere in all locations around the world, but I'm pretty sure we're doing okay here. It is January 3rd, 2017. Had to run a rerun yesterday, it being a federal holiday, and having a house full of folks, including one additional, made the noise level just a little bit too out of control for a live morning show. We are, of course, working under our new schedule here, which leaves us without Greg Dworkin for the morning as well. But he'll be back with us on Wednesday, and no doubt wishes us all a pleasant new year. As pleasant as we can make it anyway. This is, of course, the year during which, apparently, Donald Trump will assume the presidency. We have, we can't be sure of these things, but of course, all signs point to yes on that one. Miserable day today outside. I don't know how the weather is near you, but it wasn't a good start for the new year. It's one of those cold-ish, rainy days. Not quite freezing, or not that bad, but just cold, gray, rainy day, and a good reminder of what's to come. Today is, of course, January 3rd, which is a big day in the Capitol, both AL and OL. Washington, D.C., and the Capitol building, of course, Congress returning to that thing they do, which sometimes is called their work, their jobs, to convene the 115th Congress. In fact, I see, as a matter of fact, just covering the same topics. If you think I'm just, if I'm not in sync with what's going on in East Coast political Twitter anyway, I noticed Nolan Treadway says that today's weather in D.C. is very appropriate for the convening of the awful 115th Congress. And it proves to be awful, I guess, today. January 3rd, of course, is the day that we have laid out for the Senate to hijack proceedings in the morning. No indication that will actually happen. And, of course, as we laid out right in the beginning, probably the least Obama move we could think of would be an attempt to install Merrick Garland on the Supreme Court, certainly by my own method, which would be, of course, to take advantage of the possibility of a temporary, and very temporary, and sudden a majority in the intercession, I guess, and then before the swearing in of new members of the Senate, a highly speculative and experimental stance on these things. But hey, many things will which started out as speculative, experimental, legal stances came to surprise us in the past, even at high levels in the government, I guess, to wit here, Bush v. Gore, the legal theory behind which was so novel, not a single constitutional scholar of any note was willing to give it any chance of success and prevailing before the courts, and yet it did, and it changed our understanding of equal protection henceforth, even though we aren't able to use it as precedent for anything, allegedly, even though I've also seen people do that. Anyway, point is, you are not likely to see that happen today, but what we are likely to see happen over on the House side is the the dismantling of the Office of Congressional Ethics. Everybody's talking about that one, so we'll get up to date on that and let you know what's happening, why it's happening now, and what the mechanics of it are, plus lots of commentary on the subject. But of course, it is pretty much still first thing in the morning, and a good time now to share Bill's tweet from Portland, Maine. Bill himself being from Portland, Maine, or in Portland, Maine, anyway. Daily Coast Radio's live now. The evidence being me, here, clearing my throat in your ear. If this show wasn't live, you wouldn't hear me doing that. I would be taking a break and taking care of it off the air. Daily Kos Radio is live now, Kagro X. That's me, and that's how you can reach me, David Waldman, on Twitter. And I encourage you to do so. And when you do, use, as Bill did, the hashtag KITM, Kagro in the morning. I include the T for that one. And that way your comment and show suggestion stays up on my screen a little bit longer. What are we going to do with it today? Well, I resolve to switch my show over to 100% renewable airwaves in 2017. An excellent idea. Of course, we use very few airwaves as it is. We are distributed mainly by podcast, but yes, we are in fact distributed over the air as well. Thanks to the folks at We Act Radio, 1480 AM on your dial in the Washington, D.C. listening area, or catchment area, as Greg likes to say. And, so we limit our consumption of airwave resources. And I think maybe this year I'll erase all of my DVD archives of the show and use them over again just to save resources. All right. So what's happening in Congress today? This is what has got everybody's attention. And if you turn in your texts now, please, to dailykos.com, you'll see on the front page of Daily Kos that Georgia Logothetis has taken care of the morning roundup. Greg's busy. And you know the way she does it. The headlines of all the articles that she's gathered up for your perusal are gathered up, well, also for your perusal. Your quick visual inspection up at the top of the post today. Let's see. With no warning, House Republicans vote to gut independent ethics office. What else? Well, House Republicans kick off 2017 by gutting independent ethics office. Congress opens with an ambitious Republican agenda for the Trump era, is one take, and a resolution for 2017. Keep reminding Trump that he has no mandate. What are our sources? Well, let's go right to Georgia's write-up of it. In their first act of the new year, House Republicans held a secret meeting and a secret vote to essentially kill the Office of Congressional Ethics. From Eric Lipton at the New York Times, the following is offered. The surprising vote came on the eve of the start of a new session of Congress, where emboldened Republicans are ready to push an ambitious agenda on everything from health care to infrastructure, issues that will be the subject of intense lobbying from corporate interests. The House Republicans' move would take away both power and independence from an investigative body and give lawmakers more control over internal inquiries. By moving all of the authority to the House Ethics Committee, several ethics lawyers said, the House risks becoming far too protective of members accused of wrongdoing. This is huge, said Bryson Morgan, who worked as an investigative lawyer at the Office of Congressional Ethics from 2013 until 15, who now defends lawmakers targeted in ethics investigations. It effectively allows the committee to shut down any independent investigation into member misconduct. Historically, the Ethics Committee has failed to investigate member misconduct. Pardon the frog in the throat, but yeah, that kind of sums it up. Most of America, including our highly enlightened audience, is likely reading the more sensationalist headlines about a secret meeting and secret vote. What is that all about? And a good portion of the Twitter audience is, at least early on was discussing, maybe this bill would be vetoed. Of course, President Obama is still president, and President Trump or incoming President-elect Trump, has a great interest, of course, supposedly, at least rhetorically, in draining the swamp. Well, it doesn't actually work that way. This doesn't reach the president's desk. This is a resolution that will manifest itself as the House rules, the standing rules of the House of Representatives, not subject to presidential veto or signature or anything like it. It never leaves the House. It doesn't apply to the Senate either. It doesn't have the force of law. It's just the House rules. Secret meeting, secret vote. Yes, true. But here's the way the rules typically work in the House. The House, and this is important for understanding, for instance, things like the crazy complicated maneuver that I laid out for the Senate for their operations this afternoon, which they won't follow, but it's out there. The House, because it is reelected in its entirety every 2 years. That is, every single position in the House is up for election every 2 years. Not so in the Senate, as you'll recall, where only 1/3 are up for election at any given time. One of the results of this is the House considers itself to have been resolved anew each time there is a congressional election, and so they adopt their rules anew. The entire body is considered new to the House, the entire membership, that is, and even people who have been reelected. You don't simply continue in office by virtue of having been reelected. I mean, for practical purposes, you do. You get to occupy the same office, although sometimes people join in the office lottery and, move to a better digs. That'd be the physical office, not the ceremonial position or what we call the office, just by virtue of being a member of Congress. But anyway, most things can continue uninterrupted by virtue of uninterrupted service, but still the House constitutes itself anew, and so it adopts its rules all over again. Now, for practical purposes, what that often means is when there are rules changes proposed, they are proposed in the form of amendments to the readoption of the old rules. It saves time that way. Basically, most rules will remain unchanged from one Congress to the next. And so they basically just say, let's adopt that set of rules we left with last time with the following changes. And I don't know if I've ever seen, and maybe it's just never happened, I don't know if I've ever seen the House simply say, the rules are fine as is. There's always some change. Somebody's always agitated about something. This time, the change is, I guess, the gutting of this Office of Congressional Ethics. We'll get to the reasoning behind it. We'll get to their excuses for it. We'll get to commentary on what it means after we get through the mechanics. But basically, the secret meeting and secret vote part, I think, have some people scratching their heads. Day one of a new Congress is when the House will readopt its old rules plus the change package. And the House, being a majoritarian organization, basically simply takes its cue from the party that holds the majority. They will dictate what the changes in the rules will be. That's just plain old majority rules stuff. On day one, you're not likely to see a lot of defection on issues like rules. Now, remember, they also will elect a speaker, and that sometimes you will see some defections, and we can discuss that later. But that's also sort of a symbolic defection as well. It means something, and it means something serious, and it's taken seriously by the participants in the voting, but the outcome is a foregone conclusion. Why? Like with the rules, also a foregone conclusion. Why is that the case? Ahead of the convening of the new House, the caucuses of both parties, the Republicans call theirs a conference, Democrats call it a caucus. They get together, they meet, and they draw up what they think the rules changes ought to be. The Democrats will do the same too. They will very often offer their own alternative rules package. Occasionally, they might even find some agreement on the other side, the minority, whether it's Democrats or Republicans. And if that's the case, what usually ends up happening would be the majority party would simply adopt those proposed changes, put them in their own rules package, and claim credit for it. But anyway, the majority party decides for itself what rules changes should carry the day. And the intention is for the parties to go in and vote on strict party lines on the question of changing the rules. So the Republicans will have gotten together and hashed out for themselves what will those rules changes be. This gutting of the Office of Congressional Ethics was considerably more controversial than most rules changes within the Republican conference. It wasn't overwhelmingly opposed. Of course, if it had been, it wouldn't have won its approval. But there was some 70-plus votes in dissent from this, presumably from members who realized that, they're attuned to the Washington, D.C. punditry, that the optics of doing this were horrible. And they are. as our later review of the commentary on this rules change should make plain, and as Lipton's language, I think, made plain in the Times. But, this business is, although it's rules that apply to the entirety of the House, for practical purposes, all the voting will be done on party lines when the whole House convenes to make this decision, and you just do a simple count. How many Republicans are there? How many Democrats are there? And only in situations where there's some enormously contentious fight over the rules that would have split the majority conference or caucus much more deeply than this measure did. And the majority is so tenuous, maybe perhaps just 2, 3, 5 vote majority in the House, then possibly you could see something, and you would probably then at that point see that rule abandoned, because the prospect of losing a House rules vote in the opening minutes, really, of a brand new Congress would probably be optically, to borrow the optics framing, just too horrible for contemplation in a new or returning leadership, and they would just have jettisoned this rule. But as I recall, the vote was something in the neighborhood of 100 and, I don't know how many they got, 100 and whatever, plus 110, 115 to 70 something. We'll see if we can pick up the numbers later on. But there was a lot of opposition, probably because of the optics. But yes, this goes on behind closed doors. This was a meeting of the House Republican Conference. It was not a meeting of the House of Representatives. It's not a governmental meeting per se. All the people in it are members of the government, yes, but this is a meeting of the membership of the Republicans in the House to decide what will we put forth in public on the floor tomorrow for an official vote. But, being majoritarian in the House, what the majority says goes. So, yes, it was secret. How about the vote? Was that secret as well? Well, yes. This is not always the case, but generally speaking, because these are, of course, private meetings of the party organizations inside the House rather than public meetings in their capacity as legislators, very often records of how people vote are not kept. And even more difficult to keep track of is they voted the way you and I are used to voting for president or for Congress or any other public office, secret ballot. Unless, of course, you're a caucus goer, in which case you're weird and you should change your procedures in your state. But anyway, just as you might see elsewhere, secret ballot vote for whether or not to approve this new rule gutting the Office of Congressional Ethics. It won convincingly, of course, but the fact that there was so much dissent makes for a troublesome outlook. And it's rumored that Speaker Paul Ryan himself opposed the change, probably for optical reasons. But again, we'll never be sure that was the case because the secret ballot prevents us from knowing. So yes, it's not particularly nefarious. You'd like to know how people voted, but it's been done in a context in which we accept secret votes. And yes, secret meetings as well. It's a little bit of a misnomer in that, I mean, it's no secret that the meeting took place. It's no secret that the vote took place, and the results of the vote are obvious and are announced and are available to us from having read through the news media of the day. But it's not conducted in public the way a House floor vote is. So, of course, it just gives it that dark shadowing. It's not inaccurate. You don't have to retract it or anything, Lipton. But yeah, that's the reality of it. And even when it's Democrats in the majority and they're doing something wonderful for ethics, if you can imagine such a thing happening, that too would have largely been done in secret, certainly in a secret meeting. Although occasionally, every once in a while they'll allow. Republicans will sometimes do the same, allow a reporter or two in the room to cover the proceedings. But for rules, probably not. This is a very important meeting that sort of sets the tone for the entire Congress, and it's not unusual. It's not nice, but it's not unusual. So I just thought I'd at least give you that part of the background. Embedded in the story here, right after the Eric Lipton pull from the New York Times, is a tweet from Igor Volsky. House Republicans held a secret vote during a secret meeting on a national holiday. That's true, it was a federal holiday yesterday, in order to eliminate their independent ethics watchdog. It certainly doesn't look good, and some 10,000 people plus agreed that it didn't look particularly good. Oh, by the way, speaking of the statistics on this tweet, I did notice that somebody was pointing out that the House Ethics Committee chair, I think he's the chair, Bob Goodlatte from Virginia, tweeted his defense of the rules changes. Of course, this was a terrific thing, and it was going to make congressional ethics work much, much better. We'll see about that. But no one had ever seen, somebody pointed this out, a tweet with thousands upon thousands of responses, but only, a smattering of retweets and likes. Usually you see lots of people like something, a few less often will retweet the thing, but actual direct responses is usually not the highest category there. But I guess a lot of people tweeting their digital FUs to Bob Goodlatte. Probably very few people patting him on the back for this. Let's see. Next entry in Georgia's roundup of this story comes from New York Magazine. Margaret Hartman, who notes Democrats were already opposed to the package of rules changes, as will always be the case, by the way. Even when it's a spectacular set of rules changes, it's almost always the majority tailoring things to make things just a little easier for the majority, and the minority being upset about it. Very rarely is there any crossover in terms of agreement on a rules package these days. It has happened in the past, and sometimes it happens sort of as a protest vote. Occasionally you'd get serious conservative Dems crossing over and in recent years and agreeing with Republican rules packages, especially when the changes aren't tremendous. But in most cases, this is considered a party line vote. And even though the outcome is a foregone conclusion, you'll get funny looks if you're on record voting for the other side's rule package, even though your rule package was largely the same. It's the differences that matter, damn it. Anyway, Margaret Hartman writes, Democrats were already opposed to the rules changes, which include measures introduced by Ryan, interestingly enough, in an apparent attempt to prevent protests on the House floor. This is not the ethics portion, but you would have heard about this a week or two ago, right, where Ryan's idea of attempting to prevent protests on the House floor, like the Democrats sit-in against gun violence last year, and of course, like the Republicans sit-in against the halting of drilling offshore and in national parks, etc., some years before that. The drill, baby, drill here, drill now, pay less. Remember that whole protest joined in spirit by Newt Gingrich. Remember when he was promising that if you had elected him president in 2012, he would be assuring you of $2.50 gas by now, which of course would be considerably, well, not awfully, but considerably more expensive than the actual national average right now. But anyway, you remember they did exactly the same thing. In fact, that's where the idea for the sit-in came from. So many times the idea for these things comes from either Republican proposals or Republican protests. Even my thinking about using the temporary majority in the Senate essentially was based on an idea that Republicans put forward for an opening couple of weeks of a new Congress. On the Senate side, they planned a protest of the reorganization of the Senate that actually backfired, but that gave me this idea. Well, anyway, the drilling sit-in was pretty much the model for the anti-gun violence sit-in, up to and including the idea of streaming events from the House floor using smartphones. Anyway, Ryan, I guess, is incorporating that in the rules package. Then he said hobbling the ethics board shows Republicans actually have no intention of following one of Donald Trump's key campaign promises. That's the very next sentence in Hartman's write-up. It should be clear by now that Donald Trump, already the most corrupt and conflicted president-elect in history, is betraying his promise to drain the swamp, said, not Margaret Hartman, that wasn't her, Democratic National Committee spokesman Eric Walker. Now Republicans in the House are following his example, attempting to cripple the independent entity that deals with ethics in Congress. To be clear, Trump has no direct role in the House GOP's effort to curtail ethics investigations of its members. That's true. Lots of people, by the way, tweeting the comments of Kellyanne Conway on that subject. Kellyanne Conway will know nothing about that, not because she's a dunderhead. I mean, that's true too, but that's not the reason. She's just not going to be involved in that. She may actually have some pretty clear idea of what's going on and whether it's a good idea or not. I'm sure she's dealt with members of Congress in the past and has a fairly good understanding of what it is that they're doing and how they're doing it. But that's not her beat. And, I mean, the fact that she was willing to comment to the papers is nice and all, but I don't know. There was an awful lot of concentration on her comments. She's not going to be able to give us any insight on this. So, fine. You can hold up her comment and dismiss it as unhelpful if you like, but it was going to be unhelpful no matter what she had to say. So, as Hartman reminds us, this isn't really a Trump thing. The president-elect recently insisted that his effort to drain the swamp is still on, and he could prove it by calling on members of his party to leave the Office of Congressional Ethics alone. On the other hand, Trump probably doesn't want to start a war with the body that's supposed to hold him accountable for his ethics violations. And that's true. He's just not going to involve himself in this. He's not president yet, for one thing. I'm sure he will remind us of that. The one time he'll remind us he's not president yet. This isn't my job. I don't know what these guys are doing. I don't even know who these people are. Anyway, not likely that he'll call on them to do that. Although, he might take a shot because why not? But I think it'll be sort of a wink-wink thing. Let's see. We have a comment here via Twitter embedded in the piece from Daniel Schumann, who has a piece in Medium that I put aside. Schumann is a pretty informed commentator on these things, and we'll include him in our roundup of the analysis. He tweeted, the OCE, Office of Congressional Ethics, and it's a relatively new creation, as we mentioned. It's not got a long and storied history in Congress or anything like that. It's, and Congress has functioned poorly and is ill-served by the way the Ethics Committee actually functions, but they have functioned for a long time with just the Ethics Committee. The OCE, Schumann says, acts like a grand jury, finding facts and referring them on. The Ethics Committee, as it was constituted during the existence of the OCE, is like a judge, but a judge who's also your brother-in-law. And that's the fact of it. But there's really no getting around it. The Constitution reserves to the members of Congress the right to judge and punish and pass judgment on the transgressions of its members. That doesn't really belong anywhere else under the Constitution. And so you're always going to end up with a judge who's your brother-in-law. And when you're a member of the party opposite the majority of the number of brother-in-laws you've got, you're in trouble with the Ethics Committee. And when it's the majority, they can help smooth things over or just plain forgive you. That's just the way it is. And we're kind of stuck with it. Rachel Bade and John Bresnahan at Politico, writing on the subject of this morning's proceedings, Monday's effort was led in part by lawmakers who have come under investigation in recent years. They didn't like the way that worked out, and so they would like to change the procedure. Now the office would be under the thumb of the lawmakers themselves. No more independence for them. The proposal also appears to limit the scope of the office's work by barring them from considering anonymous tips against lawmakers. From now on, I guess it goes back to the old way, where if you wanted to bring up some ethics committee charges against someone, you had to get a member of the House to level them and to file them with the ethics committee. as opposed to having outside watchdog groups do it. And to be honest, I was really not ever really wild about the idea of having outside groups refer things to Congress. I kind of liked that somebody in the House would have to put their reputation on the line, but the practical effect of it, of limiting the outside ability to file charges, is that you'd often find that one, you'd only file charges against somebody from the other party, and two, that there were usually more bonkers weirdos who were willing to put their reputation on the line on the Republican side, filing crazy-looking charges against Democrats or just anybody they hated. And it wasn't really the case that it would go the other way. You know, there wasn't an equal and opposite reaction from the other side. It wasn't both sides doing it. Democrats were, for the most part, loath to put their name to a complaint that was baseless, whereas there are people on the Republican side for whom that's stock in trade because they're just known as bomb-throwing weirdos. Outside groups being allowed to do it, I think, simply, in the end, suffered from the same sort of difficulty, though there were certainly more outside Democratic-leaning groups that were willing to put their name to complaints that might not have been that might not have convinced a Democratic member of Congress to put their name to it, let's say. Again, the same imbalance existed. It was just too easy for the Republican wingnut welfare machine to simply create out of thin air and incorporate a new, non-profit watchdog group that would declare itself a congressional watchdog, but be organized solely for the purpose of filing some certain set of ethics complaints against some enemy and then really do very little else. Anyway, as Bade and Bresnahan put it in Politico, let's see, we left off, the proposal appears to limit the scope of the office's work by barring them from considering anonymous tips against lawmakers, and it would stop the office from disclosing the findings of some of their investigations, as they currently do, after the recommendations go to House Ethics. In other words, what did we just send to House Ethics? We sent a report that says Congressperson X is accused of stealing all this money, and or whatever the complaint is, and we really ought to do something about it. And they just and now they would no longer be able to do that. They would no longer be able to tell you what did they just send to the ethics committee. That's an anti-leak measure, apparently, but it's also an anti-disclosure measure. Well, we just don't know, it's not going to help very much. The vote to declaw the OCE was orchestrated by several members who felt they had been wrongfully accused of unethical behavior by the OCE, according to several sources in the room. The sources said several members, currently or formerly under the OCE's microscope, stood up to support the pitch, which was eventually adopted by a vote of, here's our numbers, 119 to 74, roughly in the area that I remembered it. Ben Jacobs has retweeted Bob Goodlatte's defense of these things. Ben Jacobs, a political reporter for The Guardian, and he tweets a link to Bob Goodlatte's tweet, which reads, here we are, midnight regulations should be this is not the tweet defending his move, but actually a tweet of his from September of this year. Basically, this is, of course, prior to the election, and aiming at late-breaking regulatory action from, or the prospect of that regulatory action from the outgoing Obama administration. He said, at that point, midnight regulations should be subjected to even greater transparency, public scrutiny, and congressional oversight, which, of course, stands in great contrast, in clear contrast to the way we've been describing the changes being proposed for the OCE. Midnight regulations, they met in secret ballot voting on a federal holiday when most people were hanging out at home or out enjoying themselves or in other ways not paying attention to what was going on. But that's on you if you weren't paying attention. But what about the greater transparency, public scrutiny, etc.? A lot of the emphasis on today's reporting is also that this was done at the last minute. Again, this is when these things happen. Occasionally you will hear word early on from the leadership of committees of jurisdiction, that is to say those committees where operations will be affected by a proposed rules change. We'll begin discussing these things ahead of time. And he certainly could have given a better heads up for it. But this is a relatively small operation, the Ethics Committee, and although it has broad impact, it's kind of a legislative backwater. I mean, they don't really do it. They don't do any legislating, the Ethics Committee. It's still supposed to be an important role, but it's just not considered one of the. I mean, it's certainly not a plum committee, and it's someplace people hate to be put. They almost would do almost anything to get off of the Ethics Committee. Anyway, but good point in Ben Jacobs bringing up Bob Goodlatte's desire for transparency for others, but I guess not for himself. But he's not operating in a atmosphere that requires any more transparency than that members of the House today put their names on record as either opposing or supporting the change in the rules, including this OCE rule, and I guess the protest rule as well. It's just, that's the one shot you get at getting them on the record. But they'll be there out in the open doing it. And if you want, there's time today for you to call your member of Congress, whether newly elected for the first time or re-elected, and let them know what you think of this rules package and the gutting of the OCE. Call them and tell them they're going to vote the way they vote anyway, but you can call them and yell at them, and it's a meaningful thing to get yelled at right away, or first thing out of the box by your constituents. So I encourage you to go ahead and do it. I saw somewhere out there today someone tweeting that there was I guess some sort of app that would allow you to text your zip code to a certain number, and it would give you the telephone number for your member of Congress. The zip code won't always get it 100% accurate, by the way. This is one of the dumbest things about the way congressional districts are drawn, besides gerrymandering, is that it's actually not particularly easy to identify the proper member of Congress representing anybody by you have to get their address, and you have to know where the lines are drawn. The easiest way is to sort it by zip code, and you'll be able to get it right with about, I don't know, probably about 95% accuracy. But some significant portion of the population lives in split zip codes and in places where one side of the street is in one congressional district and the other side is in another. Certainly that's the case on state legislative lines as well, usually more so on the state level. The more local you get, the easier it is to divide things that way. But anyway, for the most part, you'll get the right person. And if you get one district over, well, it doesn't really matter that much. Call and admonish people regardless. Josh Marshall at TPM also quoted in Georgia's Roundup. Let's see what he has to say and about what. Now, the reports from Capitol Hill are that Speaker Ryan and Majority Leader McCarthy warned against the move. I guess we'd be talking about the OCE gutting here. And I don't doubt that's true as far as it goes. As in, they said, oh, please don't do this. But come on, if the Speaker of the House and the Majority Leader really don't want something to happen, they can stop it. They didn't. The vote passed 119 to 74. This is all part of Ryan's better way. So who voted for it and who didn't? If you live in a Republican district, by all means, call your member of Congress and find out. It's called Representative Goodlatte's proposal to put the OCE under the authority of the Ethics Committee, for those people who are wanting to call and complain or call and find out if they're a Republican member of Congress voted for it in conference. Elizabeth Warren has a tweet also embedded herein. Please tell us, GOP, who exactly thinks that the problem with Washington is that we have too many rules requiring the government to act ethically? Good question. There will be no answer. Turning to Donald Trump and his lies about job creation, Georgia says, the New York Times pens an editorial on the topic and uses the word lie in the headline. Looking at you, Wall Street Journal. Yes, over the weekend and over the holiday, more detail about the carrier job deal and various other job creating deals. And the Wall Street Journal made news over the weekend, lots of commentary via Twitter, and I did put some of that aside too. Very revealing in their comments. I don't recall whose comments they were, but the upshot of the deal was, remember, the lie, using the word lie in the headline. Wall Street Journal, I guess, was called to account for its unwillingness to call Donald Trump's lie. I mean, it was a lie. I'm just trying to... How did they say it? Well, his story... You remember the story he told during the election? It was outrageous that he had actually seen, I guess, what he imagined to be Muslim Americans on 9/11, right, dancing in the streets or on the rooftops or wherever. He said he saw him in Jersey City. First of all, there was no way he's in Jersey City. But you recall that story. Oh, well, they were dancing after 9/11. I saw it, and nobody has ever seen such a thing. And I saw it on CNN, and CNN says we never aired such a thing. It didn't happen. The police must know about it. The police say we didn't say anything about that either. But he's stuck to that, and it is a lie. And I don't know. For some reason, the Wall Street Journal was loath to call it such. Many people were, but the Wall Street Journal was the one. Here's what I put aside for it. They were the ones, I guess, caught out in this situation, explaining why they wouldn't call it a lie. I have here a tweet from who? Let me open it up. James Poniwozik. How does he say that? Poniwozik? Poniwozik? I don't know. He's a famous guy. He's a New York Times TV critic. There we are. Oh, it says it right here in his profile. It's Panawazik. Thanks for asking. See? I asked, and he said, thanks for asking. That's a guy who knows what's going on in the world. Put the pronunciation here. Panawazik. Poniewozik, in case you've never seen the name before. But there you go. James Panawazik. What did he tweet? That's the more important thing. This, he says, is the Overton window of... I guess really, this is how the Overton window of lying works. Lie so brazenly that news outlets worry they'll look biased by saying so. The liar benefits. He, in this case, retweeting, tracing the lineage here, retweeting Adam Serwer, who is in turn tweeting this from Wall Street Journal editor Baker. I don't know who Baker is, but he's an editor, I swear. Gives up the game. Not objectivity that matters, but the appearance of objectivity. A quote then taken from and linked to in Politico. The quote being this: I think it's then up to the reader to make up their own mind to say, this is what Donald Trump says. This is what a reliable, trustworthy news organization reports. And you know what? I don't think that's true. I think if you start ascribing a moral intent, as it were, to someone by saying that they've lied, I think you run the risk that you look like you're not being objective, he said. And I get the point. It's just a terrible one. There are times when I think it is less than clear that there's been an intentional lie. I don't love the idea. By the way, Gerard Baker is the Baker we're talking about over at Wall Street Journal. I've clicked through to the Politico piece. And this, the piece, by the way, by Hadass Gold, New York Times, Wall Street Journal editors take on Trump and the media. But I thought that was a rather significant point, and everyone was talking about it, and everyone sort of pointing at the Wall Street Journal there and saying, yeah, I mean, when it's something so clear-cut and the accusation is being made, and it's particularly egregious and just dangerous to the people that are being lied about, Muslim Americans extraordinarily vulnerable in this situation, you ought to be able to call that out and say, yeah, that's been pretty much proven to be false. You might as well just go ahead and say it's a lie. When there's more gray area, where there's less certainty about intent, I mean, it's pretty clear what the intent was here. It's going to be tough. There's going to be squeakers, but this one, I think the reason that the tweet and the commentary were so popular was because, yeah, everybody pretty much knew that this was a lie and it was an easy call. Anyway, yes, so turning to Donald Trump, as Georgia was, the New York Times penned an editorial on the topic and used the word lie in the headline. What was that headline? Was that up here in the roundup? No, it wasn't one of the ones that made the roundup picture. At least none of those have the word lie in it. But here's what the New York Times had to say. It's easy to see why SoftBank and Sprint, that's the job creation deal we were talking about this time, might want to help Mr. Trump take credit for creating jobs. SoftBank's chief executive, Masayoshi Son, wants the Department of Justice's Antitrust Division and the Federal Communications Commission to allow a merger between Sprint and T-Mobile. In 2014, regulators appointed by President Obama made clear to Mr. Son that they would not approve such a transaction because it would cut the number of national wireless companies to 3 from 4, greatly reducing competition in a concentrated industry. Mr. Son sees a new opening for this deal in Mr. Trump, who has surrounded himself with people who have sided with large telecommunications companies in regulatory debates and have argued against tough antitrust enforcement. Of course, many of the people Mr. Trump has surrounded himself with own large telecommunications companies, or large chunks of them, and might very well be expected to approve of such things. This is crony capitalism, the Times continues, with potentially devastating consequences. If Mr. Trump appoints people to the Antitrust Division and the FCC who are willing to wade through a Sprint-T-Mobile merger, he will do lasting damage to the economy that far outweighs any benefit from 5,000 jobs that might have been created even without the merger. Individuals and businesses will find wireless service costs a lot more when they have only Verizon, AT&T, and T-Mobile/Sprint to choose from. That's entirely likely. That's what basic economics would tell you. But basic economics almost very rarely, if ever, controls in these kind of high-level situations where of enormous market concentration. In the end, though, it always comes out that way. Prices rise in the long run. But in the short run, of course, they can structure things such that, with a loss leader in mind. Well, see, we didn't raise prices. All this worry about anti-competitive behavior, monopolistic behavior is unwarranted. We should be able to merge with AT&T now as well. Yeah, it certainly does outweigh, it would seem, the benefit of 5,000 jobs. That's the promise of what would be created. And by the way, basic economics will tell you, I think, that pretty much the opposite will obtain long term. The idea of merging Sprint and T-Mobile and having that increase jobs long term, probably not. It may be that 5,000 new positions are created for some reason, and they may even become permanent positions, but the economic benefits to the buyer of a Sprint T-Mobile merger would be lost if that were the case. I mean, generally speaking, what you're looking for from merging two pretty well-developed going concerns is that if you merge the two of them, you can merge not only their assets, but workforces and end up laying off more people and then were employed by the two of them. That's one of the economies of scale that you're going to reap from that kind of a merger. You're going to slash your payroll. And payroll is probably one of the biggest cost centers companies like that have got. By slashing that, there's more cash sloshing around in the slush fund for the management to siphon off. That's the point of doing these things. So, in all likelihood, if there's a $5,000 or 5,000 jobs created package attached to this, in all likelihood, there are 10,000 jobs being eliminated somewhere else. Anyway, so as far as the cost benefit of this goes, if by benefit you mean 5,000 jobs will be created, that's probably pretty ephemeral. And it's the wrong analysis too. The cost benefit analysis, the cost benefit analysis that matters is the one that the shareholders do, and 5,000 additional payroll jobs, 5,000 additional people on the payroll is a cost from the stockholders' perspective, the shareholders' perspective. And remember, we've been taught in business schools, business works this way: maximize shareholder value. I think that's wrong. I think that's a distortion. I think it's an intentional one. I think it's a tragedy that everyone's been taught that, and at such a basic level that they rarely ever question whether or not that could be true. And anybody who does question it is probably a communist. But, well, there we are. Anyway, the calculation that matters for the merger is, will there be more money made by the shareholders? And the answer, if it's yes, well, if it's not yes, they won't do the merger. They'll get sued for doing the merger. But if the answer is, yeah, we'll make out, who will profit from it, that can only work if something is eliminated from the package. Taking the one of Sprint and the one of T-Mobile and putting them together and saying, well, you benefit because you now own two, doesn't work. It's in order for there to be cash extracted here, in order for there to be a real reason to marry the one and the one, it's got to come out somehow, come out costing less than two in the end. If it just costs shareholders the sum of the two, you might as well have left them alone. That's, again, just basic economics. So what usually happens in things like this is, well, we can either dismantle and sell off the infrastructure of one of the two companies. That's not likely to happen. But occasionally, some of that stuff is going to be redundant, and you can say, well, we can at least eliminate the cost of maintaining this part of one of these two networks because the other one's network is better, and we'll just use that one and let the other one, I guess we could just let it languish. Or, better yet, we can sell it off to off-brand carriers and thereby claim that we're increasing competition again and get past the regulators. But more likely, that's a pretty good asset to liquidate and sell off. That's better than most companies have got to offer. More likely, or more often, the case is, if you're combining two cat food producing companies, all right, well, we get to sell off our canning equipment from one of them. That's not a big deal. But the bigger deal is now, instead of two factories with 500 workers, we can have one factory with 800 workers, and 200 people get laid off, and we get to divide up that money amongst ourselves. Shareholders win. Yay. That's what's going to come out of this, too. 5,000 jobs is easily enough erased. It's not worth anything. All right, moving on here. Let's see. Next up, it's an all Georgia show here. She's a good roundup. Well, the roundup's always good, but usually we have Greg here presenting it for us, and I don't have to do the job myself. If Greg were absent and Greg had done the roundup, we'd probably be doing this with Greg's writing. John Nichols, next up in the roundup, making an excellent point in the nation. Let's go see what it is. Trump earned 2.9 million fewer votes than his Democratic rival. You remember who that was? The Republican earned just 46.1% of the popular vote. Only a narrow electoral college advantage made him president-elect. Republican Senate candidates earned a little over 42% of the votes in contests across the country, far from receiving a full-throttle endorsement from an electorate that is enthusiastic about approving Trump's extreme cabinet picks and potentially even more extreme judicial nominees, the Senate Republican caucus lost 2 seats. Republican House candidates earned roughly 49% of the vote in contests across the country, far from receiving a full-throttle endorsement of an electorate that is enthusiastic about dismembering Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security and redistributing wealth upwards to the billionaire class. Ryan's House caucus lost 6 seats. And yet, they will be moving full throttle with those agendas anyway. Again, just a reminder, overwhelming loss in the popular vote for the presidency for the Republicans, and yet they will occupy the presidency. Not so overwhelming, but a clear loss. Actually, it is pretty overwhelming. 42% of the vote in the Senate, and yet they will hold the majority. And a minority of the popular vote in the House, and yet they will hold the majority there as well. Our system is weird and increasingly sucky. And closing today's roundup, Georgia says, with Eugene Robinson, writing at the Post, of course, to read Trump's win as some kind of sweeping victory for conservatism would be absurd. Progressive voices, loud ones, will be needed to hold him accountable. One thing we learned during the campaign is that Trump's voters, unlike many congressional Republicans, do not necessarily see big government as oppressive. They rely on its help. Remember that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. I point that out not to delegitimize Trump's election, though that helps, but to refute the notion that Trump's America is somehow more real than mine or yours or anyone else's. The America that supports progressive policies, rejects racism and sexism in all their forms, and believes that what critics call political correctness is actually just common courtesy. That America is real too and needs to make itself heard. So, go out and make yourself heard, everybody. Thanks very much, Georgia, for that roundup. Let us, by the way, check in on Twitter. I usually have it open on a second screen here, but the other one does not seem to want to work today. What do we got in the way of commentary coming in? Oh, look, Greg is listening in, by the way. Says, let's see, where did this come from? 43 minutes ago. Been there before in 2004. What are we talking about? Yes, the gutting of the Congressional Ethics Office, this time pointed out by the folks over at MSNBC's Rachel Maddow show. Steve Bannon, the lead blogger there. Republicans move to gut Congressional Ethics Office. It's time to move on to the commentary on that subject, and we'll comment on the commentary. Easy enough. Good place to start then, Steve Bannon's article on it, and reminding us that in the 2004 elections, voters handed Republicans control over the White House, House and Senate, and gubernatorial offices. I love the word gubernatorial. Say it as often as you can. With Democrats lacking any levers of power, not unlike now. Republicans were in a truly dominant position for the first time in a generation. Almost immediately, GOP officials got to work. And what they do? They weakened ethics rules. Led by then House Majority Leader Tom DeLay, remember that name, congressional Republicans moved swiftly, behind closed doors, with no Democratic input, to ease the ethics burdens on members of Congress. Again, behind closed doors, no Democratic input. Standard, but it certainly is damning when you read it that way. As longtime readers may recall, a young congressman by the name of Mike Pence was especially fond of weaker ethics rules. The results weren't pretty. In the ensuing Congress, an astonishing number of members, nearly all of whom were Republicans, were caught up in a series of damaging scandals. Remember the Abramoff affair? Some of which put members of Congress behind bars. Democrats ran against the culture of corruption 2 years later and won both chambers. In the 2016 elections, voters once again put Republicans in a dominant position, and just like 12 years ago, Republican lawmakers, before tackling any other priority, although there is no opportunity to tackle any other priority, met behind closed doors, as they always do, to weaken their own ethics rules, which, admittedly, they could have avoided. That's my comment on it. NBC News reported overnight, just hours before the 115th Congress gavels in, House Republicans voted to weaken the independent ethics office that investigates House lawmakers and staff accused of misconduct. During a closed-door meeting Monday by a vote of 119 to 74, House Republicans defied their leadership to adopt an amendment by Representative Bob Goodlatte of Virginia to place the Office of Congressional Ethics, known as the OCE, under the jurisdiction of the House Ethics Committee. The move effectively gives the ethics oversight and investigative role to the lawmakers themselves and prevents information about investigations from being released to the public. It's basically the way it used to be. Although I guess one spin you could put on it is, yeah, this is the way it used to be. Remember the bad old days when there were innumerable scandals with Abramoff and members of Congress ended up going to jail? Yeah. Well, we're going back to that. The part where members go to jail sounded pretty good, but okay, it was an uphill battle to be sure. The changes adopted by Republicans who debated them among themselves in secret are surprisingly broad. Vox's report added, the House committee could force the office to stop an investigation at any time. That is bad. And the office would be prevented from accepting and investigating anonymous tips. The office would no longer be able to relay an issue to law enforcement if it determines a crime is committed. That also is not very good. It's easily the biggest rollback of ethics rules since the last time Republicans swept the national election, Bennon points out. That the GOP majority has made this the first priority of a new Congress, which begins today, suggests the country is in for a rough ride for the next 2 years. That these same Republicans have also said they intend to ignore Donald Trump's ethics scandals only adds insult to injury. The second point, I think, better than the first, but it is still true. It's good rhetoric to say this was the first priority of the new Congress. As Rachel's segment on the show last night emphasized, these changes are not yet a done deal. The GOP majority agreed to gut the ethics rules last night, but every member of the House will vote today on the new rules package for the 115th Congress. If the controversy surrounding Republican plans to gut their own ethics process gets too intense, it's entirely possible members will end up undoing the decision made behind closed doors last night. That, too, would be a replay of the 2004 actions. After initially voting to allow members under criminal indictment to serve in the House Republican leadership, Republican lawmakers eventually reversed course on that one, restoring the ethics rule they'd weakened. So there is precedent for turning them around at the last minute, and we're thankful that that's been brought to our attention. Thank you, Greg. That's true. Call. You've got time. It's easy enough to do. And by the way, if you're listening live, there is a main switchboard at Congress, which, as I recall, was it 224, I think, is the exchange on Capitol. It's the Senate side, but I think that's the main desk. 224 was it 5,000 or 5,100? I forget what the old congressional switchboard thing is. Let me see if I can Google that up. Does it tell us? Oh yeah, that's right. Well, the old school one was 202-224-3121. That gets you the main Capitol switchboard. You got to know who your member of Congress is in that case, and you can get House or Senate from there in case you want to call and yell at the Senate for one reason or another. But if you're talking about the Office of Congressional Ethics, it's the House guys that you'll want to yell at. Figure out who is your member of Congress. You probably just voted for or against them very recently. If you can recall who that is, 202-224-3121 will get you to an operator who will put you through to their offices, and a bored-sounding or harried, perhaps, sounding intern will take your call and scratch down on a piece of paper or a one or one of the all hash mark for them to count up how many calls are coming in complaining about this. And that's about how it'll be operating in these congressional offices today. And whether or not members choose to disregard the number of calls that they get complaining about it, well, you'll find out today on C-SPAN. You can watch, although you won't be able to watch them voting one by one. That's something that C-SPAN still hasn't found the bandwidth to manage. And I think that they could be doing it online, but they haven't been. Something I would like to see improved over at C-SPAN. By the way, something I actually once had a tremendous plan for when I ran Congress Matters for Daily Kos, those many years ago. One of the things I wanted to get was they have access live to a electronic feed on the House floor of which members have voted and how they voted. And if you're observing the House, if you go to Washington, D.C. and get gallery tickets, and I can explain how you actually do that, but they're available to the general public. You can go to Washington, D.C. if you're visiting the Capitol, if you're willing to wait in line and go through the process of getting tickets from your member of Congress. You can go in there and sit and watch for 5, 10, 15 minutes, depending on how many people are waiting in the public gallery, and you can watch it. If you're happy, if you happen to be there during a vote, you will see the big boards that come up that display everybody's name and in red and green lights, whether they voted yay or nay on a certain measure or not voted at all. And each of the whips desks on both sides, both party whips, have access on the floor via computer to a breakdown of that, and they can see not only how each member has voted, but they can sort them by party, sort them by district, sort them by state, sort them by anything that they want, and monitor each individual member's vote in real time. If you are at home and you watch on C-SPAN, all you get is the total, how many Republicans have voted yes, how many Republicans have voted no, how many Republicans have not voted, how many Democrats similar, how many independents similar, right? And you can only track occasionally. Back in the days when Bernie Sanders was the independent in the House, you could only track Bernie Sanders and how he voted, because otherwise you couldn't tell one Democrat or one Republican from another. But that's information that's available. It's not secret. It's not being hidden. It's available to members on the floor and members of the public and the press who are in attendance in Washington. So, but the point is that the information exists, and it even exists in digital format, so it could easily be distributed in real time publicly over the internet. It could be distributed in real time over C-SPAN television networks, but they couldn't figure out any way to visually present that information without jamming the screen full of tiny print that nobody can read and obscuring all the action on the House floor that they were trying to cover. But in the modern era, of course, if you're watching online at cspan.com instead of on the television channel, you should be able to bring up enhanced data. And in fact, with most smart, the smart TVs that we've got now that are so they're also just as wired and connected, you should be able to bring that up in supplementary information. But certainly, if you're watching online, if you want to, you should be able to minimize a screen with the video feed and then scroll through who's voted how, which is information that you would have if you were sitting in the gallery. You should be able to have that at home at your fingertips. How do you get that information? Well, it's a long story, but basically all of the video and all the other data really is available to members of the press galleries who could distribute it, but they don't. Print newspapers, of course, there would be no point in trying to distribute that in real time. Well, even on their websites now, people just don't consume the news that way. C-SPAN could certainly do it. Anyway, the members of the gallery are the only ones with the access to that information for some reason, even though it's public. It's just, how do you pipe it out? Where do you put it? The House could do this. The House could decide for itself that the House.gov website will have this information in real time. There's just been no pressure ever to do it. It's just not something most people imagine, either thought about or imagined that they could pressure the Congress to do. But you could. I tried. It didn't work. We got a little bit of improvement, but in order to get all this information as a member of the press gallery, you got to, though, be approved by the other press gallery members, which is, of course, the professional media covering Congress, and they were in no mood to approve Congress Matters or Daily Kos, the lowly bloggers who don't know anything about anything, to join them there. The big plan was, if I had managed to get credentials there at the press gallery, would be to then say, okay, well, C-SPAN so far is the only taker for this video, but I'd like to have the video too. Can I have it? After all, it's public domain video that C-SPAN carries. As I mentioned last week, this is a good base. It's a good thing to build on the base of what I told you last week, maybe the week before, when we were talking about the House protest crackdown and how C-SPAN appears to have the monopoly on floor video of the House, but really the floor video is owned and provided by the House itself, and C-SPAN just appropriates it, or it's offered up free to members of the press gallery. C-SPAN is one of them, and they're the only one to date who has built the bandwidth to distribute it via satellite and cable. Other people could do it. They just never did. And they dedicate their bandwidth to their dumb channels of, Morning Joe instead of the fabulous content that C-SPAN could bring you. But there's not a whole hell of a lot of a market for it. Everybody knows that they can get that coverage on C-SPAN, so they go there for it, even though it's boring, horrible coverage sometimes. But it's straightforward and without commentary. That's probably the best way. You should have at least one channel that provides it that way. But I think that there's room for even for partisan commentary, like listening to home team football or baseball broadcasts or basketball broadcasts on the radio. You want that kind of bias sometimes. Sometimes it can be fun and entertaining. Like I originally thought the idea could be called Political Science Theater 3000. We'd watch on C-SPAN, and instead of just sitting there silently during votes, you could be commenting on here's the real-time information on who's voting how, and I can show it to you. And you can examine it yourself at politicalscience3000.com or .org or whatever the hell you would call the thing, and you could provide the same video. C-SPAN doesn't own it. The House does. It's piped up into the gallery, the press gallery. All you got to do is find room to plug into the board and pipe it out. I don't know if there is room. I mean, there's only one outlet that really wants the stuff. C-SPAN might have, the stuff is probably glued into the board there. But I don't know what it looks like literally, but essentially there's a big, video output board, and there's plugs in there that go out from the House board to the C-SPAN video trucks. They're not really out there. And the big satellites, and it just beams out what you see as C-SPAN, but that's just lifted from the House, and it's fine because it's public domain. They don't charge them anything for it. I should theoretically be able to plug into that too and put it out at politicalsciencetheater3000.org and do my own commentary over it. And I should be able eventually to convince the whip operations to share their digitized version of live real-time voting, because after all, again, although that the sorting program is maybe they might consider to be proprietary to themselves, I doubt very much that it is, and a sorting program could certainly be written in the public domain outside of these things, but the fact of live real-time vote results, they're being projected up on the wall of the House chamber. There's no secret to protect there. That could be fed digitally. I could have that on your desktop for all of these votes, and we could be talking about it in live and in real time rather than watching it on C-SPAN and tweeting it to one another. But we don't, because reasons. We don't really. The reason is because the person who came up with the idea is a dirty, filthy blogger, and we don't allow that. So there you go. I don't know whether they would still say the same thing. Probably. But it might be different under a Democratic majority. It was briefly different under the brief Democratic return to majority after the 2006 elections, and we got as far as convincing Nancy Pelosi's office to push the right buttons to make it possible to feed the House floor video to the House.gov website, such that at least C-SPAN was not the only place online where you could find House floor video, and you weren't dependent on their capture of it and their archiving of it, which then becomes proprietary once they've archived it. If you want to search and use clips of House floor activity from C-SPAN, you got to use their tools to search it, edit it, cut it, and then, of course, when you run it, it will have the C-SPAN, not watermark, but the crayon Chiron Mark, rather, will be in the corner there. And that's not so terrible or anything, but, again, you got to agree to their terms, etc., for public domain video. Whereas there were rudimentary editing tools available, pretty easily made available at house.gov. And, theoretically, you could then have grabbed that video feed and piped that out to Political Science Theater 3000. But then, of course, after that, at that point, then you need resources and engineers and programmers to make it happen and maintain it at high enough levels that you don't find your internet tubes clogged when too many people log on. It was a big project. But if only there were some public interest group that had tremendous amounts of money to spend on that kind of transparency. Darn it, I could never find them, no matter who I asked. Maybe they exist now, at the end of the Republic. Anyway, how's that for a backgrounder? Thought I'd throw that one in there just to remind you of who you're talking to, damn it. So I don't just sit around all the time and gab on the radio. Occasionally I try to hatch amazing plans to change the transparency of government. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes I try to get Supreme Court nominees installed at the last second. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. Okay. Moving on. I don't know that we need necessarily to go on with additional analysis of what happens with the House ethics plan. And I don't know where that stands right now. It may already have been commented on, let's say. There may already be writing going on about Republicans being moved to change their minds in real time. I don't think the House has yet gavelled in. They apparently come in at 11 for some reason, even though, just as would be the case with the Senate, noon would be when the old House dissolves and the new terms of the new House and Senate begin. But it might be that the House is gaveling in at 11 to finish up business and adjourn the 114th Congress sine die. Sometimes they do that on the same day. But they won't be in yet. So they'll be around to take your calls if you feel like complaining for the next hour or so. Let's see. We also have Greg's other comment was that, yes, when we did cover this one, that the new changes also eliminates direct referral to law enforcement. That's true. Let's say then that we'll take a look at, I mentioned to you that Daniel Schumann, I thought, was a pretty worthy observer of these sorts of things, and he had a piece at Medium on the ethics changes, effort underway to undermine the House's ethics watchdog. And there is an update. At 10:05 a.m. today, we are trying to find out which members voted to gut OCE. You can help. Follow this link. They have a link there. It actually leads to the Sunlight Foundation. Schumann used to be over at the Sunlight Foundation, is now currently the policy director of Demand Progress, which you can follow on Twitter. Anyway, follow their link. The link I'm reading is at medium.com. Can I tweet this thing out here? Yeah, there we go. I can share it by tweeting this out, and I'll send it out over my Twitter feed. So if you happen to be listening live, you can find that there. And, whoops, I wanted to retweet it over the Daily Coast Radio Twitter account as well. So if you happen to be listening live and you want to join in the effort to find out who voted how, you can try and do that. Follow the link. Let them know over at Sunlight Foundation who voted to undermine the OCE, if you can get that answer out of a Republican member of Congress. Let's see. He's got things running in reverse chronological order here. There's another update that goes back to 7:22 p.m. last night. This, I guess, already in your hands as far as news goes. House Republicans in a secret meeting of their conference voted 119 to 74 to undermine the OCE by subsuming it under the Ethics Committee, taking away most of its powers and undermining its transparency. The vote itself is secret. The amendment will be placed in the House Rules package, voted on what is now today, which inevitably will pass. This is bad news, and we must keep calling on Congress to restore and strengthen OCE. The text of the amendment, thanks to Eric Lipton's digging, is also available in a link in the Medium piece. An effort apparently is afoot today, he began in his original article, to weaken the House Independent Ethics Watchdog by placing it under the House Ethics Committee. This would undermine the very purpose it is meant to serve. OCE was created because Congress and the general public viewed the House Ethics Committee as having failed in its duties to police the House of Representatives, resulting in a series of transgressions culminating in the Abramoff corruption scandal and the Foley Page sexting scandal. Going back that far, yikes. OCE and the Ethics Committee are institutional rivals with very different roles. OCE investigates bad behavior and adds transparency to the process. The Ethics Committee operates in secret, and only it can mete out punishment. That, by the way, an important part of the spin. I have seen people defending the OCE gutting on Twitter today by saying, oh, you can't even name one, or even worse, a partisan version of it. OCE needs to be brought to heel. They never punished even one Democrat in Congress, ever. They're so biased. How biased are they? They're so biased that they never were able to bring themselves to punish a single Democrat in Congress. Of course, that's one of those half-truths that works so well in the fake news business. OCE never punished any member of Congress because it's not in the business of punishing members of Congress. It doesn't do that. It's not empowered to do that. It never was empowered to do that. It never should be empowered to do that. That's the province of the membership of the House, and they delegate that responsibility to the Ethics Committee. Ethics Committee punishes members of either party. OCE does not. It is a fake news lie to say that one of the reasons that the OCE should be gutted is that it never punished a single Democrat. If you happen to run into that or some other version of it, now you know. OCE investigates bad behavior. Ethics Committee operates not only in secret, but to mete out the punishment. According to reporter Billy House, Bob Goodlatte is leading the charge to undermine the OCE. Billy House tweets, proposed Goodlatte amendment to rules package would place the Independent Office of Congressional Ethics under oversight of the Ethics Committee. Just recently, a bipartisan coalition of open government and ethics organizations called on the House to reauthorize OCE without weakening its powers. They wrote, OCE is one of the stellar ethics accomplishments of the House of Representatives. It has helped change a secretive and oft-perceived moribund ethics enforcement process into a reasonably more accountable and active system. It seems that the amendment is being offered as part of the internal House Republican Conference debate on the rules of the House of Representatives, which is taking place today. That would have been yesterday. House Republicans will present their rules package late tonight or tomorrow. It'll be voted on Tuesday. That's today. In doing so, this also apparently violates the Republicans' Pledge to America, dun, 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 which says that Republicans will, quote, give all representatives and citizens at least 3 days to read the bill before a vote. This pledge has been interpreted as requiring at least 3 legislative days. Remember that old promise? Well, guess what? It's okay. It doesn't matter because this isn't a bill. It's a resolution. Yay. They're out from underneath that one. Okay. That's a technicality, but, you know, that's certainly not what people had in mind. Anyway, you remember that old rule. Everybody gets 3 days to read a bill before a vote. I'm having trouble now seeing how public release of the proposed House rules tonight or tomorrow will satisfy that 3-day legislative requirement, says Daniel, but I see how it works. But it certainly violates the spirit. That's true. Other legislation intended for consideration this upcoming week is already online, which begs the question, why not here? The answer is, it's legislation, and this isn't. We are reaching out by Twitter to encourage the House to leave OCE as an independent ethics watchdog. Please retweet Daniel's tweet here. Stop the House's assault on ethics watchdog. Tell Speaker Ryan, GOP leader, and Steve Scalise, that is, remember, David Duke without the baggage. Keep OCE independent. Call your representative at 202-224-3121, and I'll tweet that one out because it's got the phone number in it too. There you go. Find it. Don't be afraid to act. The Office of Congressional Ethics is one of the best congressional reforms of the past 2 decades, Daniel continues. Weakening it, in particular placing it under the Enervated Ethics Committee, will foster corruption and undermine congressional transparency. There was an update from yesterday afternoon at 5:40 with a description of the Goodlatte Amendment. Might as well take a look at that one. It renames the Office of Congressional Ethics and calls it now the Office of Congressional Complaint Review. That's interesting. It places it under the oversight of the Committee on Ethics. It provides protections against disclosures to the public or other government entities and requires that any matter that may involve a violation of criminal law must be referred to the Committee on Ethics. Provides greater certainty as to the commencement and termination of any review, including timely notice to the subject and Committee on Ethics. Bars the consideration of anonymous complaints and requires rules changes to better safeguard the exercise of due process rights of both subject and witness. This is the best possible description of these things, no doubt provided by Goodlatte's office. Limits the jurisdiction of the office to the last 3 Congresses to conform to the statute of limitations for the Committee on Ethics. Interesting. In other words, he says, it eviscerates OCE. Another update, statement for attribution to Daniel himself, Policy Director of Demand Progress. So if you're a reporter, you can grab his quote there. Let's see. In a 9:28 a.m. Tuesday update, my colleague at Crew, Adam Rappaport, tweets that over the last 2 Congresses, OCE has about a 50% ratio of referring matters on to the House Ethics Committee. Journalist Steve Rich tweeted that his article, 10 members of Congress took trips secretly funded by foreign governments, would not have been possible without the work of the OCE. That tweet embedded in here as well. Not only is that true, but OCE's report showed where the House Ethics Committee failed to do its job and misled members into taking trips and receiving gifts that federal law prohibits. So another important watchdog, just that actually prevents ethical lapses somehow, will also now be missing from the picture. Okay, very interesting. There's lots of commentary on the subject, of course, and plenty available, and perhaps we can share some of that with you in the roundup summary post of today's podcast. Moving on to a couple other subjects. I told you that there's this guy, Donald Trump, who you just won't believe what's going on with this guy. Of course, you can't keep up with all the nonsense going on. And I guess we might not even be able to try. Okay. But we'll take a crack at it and see what's new. Let me see. Is this something that relates? We might be able to use this segue. Rebecca Berg tweeting, I think it's pretty clear Trump is taking issue here with the optics of the GOP's timing, not with the gutting of OCE, which he calls unfair. I guess he calls the OCE unfair. Greg Sargent has got a tweet embedded in this one, which reads, folks, Trump's transition must clarify whether he actually opposes the GOP move or merely what order Republicans are doing things in. And apparently he has these tweets, Mr. Trump does, from earlier this morning. Let's see. With all that Congress has to work on, do they really have to make the weakening of the independent ethics watchdog, as unfair as it may be, their number one act and priority? Focus on tax reform, health care, and so many other things of far greater importance. It is hashtagged DTS. What does that mean? I don't know. Does that mean that he actually tweeted it? I don't know what the DTS? Anyway, I'm not sure what the hashtag is supposed to mean. But the answer to the question is, yeah, they do have to make it their number one act. It doesn't necessarily mean it's their number one priority, but if it's going to be in the new rules package, that's got to be done at the top. Well, it doesn't have to be. That's true. I mean, I guess they could make that change at any time. The House needs only a bare majority to change its rules. By the way, as does the Senate, but never mind that. We like to pretend that that's not the case. But it's openly the case in the House. They could certainly delay this and give some extra consideration to it. There's no reason why it has to be done today. But traditionally, the rules are voted on at this point. And what can I tell you? They're suckers for tradition, I guess. Rosalind McGregor, by the way, tells us that she has called her congressman's local office on the OCE. That is, thanks very much for doing that one, Rosalind. By the way, I mean, if you're interested, I'll comment on this. Here's what happens. You call your congressman's local office and they'll say, okay, duly noted. What usually happens with that, I don't know whether they still do things this way, but on something where they really don't want to hear from you, I don't know. It depends on whether your local congressman is a Democrat or a Republican to some extent. But if it's a Republican that you called and they know that they're going to vote for this rules package regardless because they're a Republican and it's embarrassing, et cetera, what they'll do is they'll mark down perhaps how many people called on the subject and probably take your name and email address or phone number or address if they intend to write back to you, usually a mailing address. And they'll send you a mass mailing that says, thank you for your interest. I understand your concern. I believe that the office of the OCE needed certain reforms and blah, blah, blah. And these things are great. And then they'll mail that to you. But in the meantime, the district office will forward, sometimes by snail mail, a report on, okay, well, here's what came in. It's not something that they'll immediately call Washington and say, you're not going to believe it, Rosalind McGregor doesn't want us to vote for this thing. I'm sure you never imagined that they were going to do that anyway, but it won't even be a matter of, well, the House is going into session soon. What are the phone calls saying in the district office? It's not going to show up. They're not going to. Okay. So what I'm saying is, if you got the time, 202-224-3121, ask for your congressman's office in D.C. and tell the board intern who answers the phone there. That's the way to be heard in advance of a vote you anticipate on the floor on the same day. Dave Gilligan has told us, oh yes, DTS is drain the swamp. That's right. Okay, thanks very much for clarifying that. I don't follow the guy quite that closely. I see a million of his. I actually don't follow Donald Trump. Do any of you follow Donald Trump with your own Twitter feeds? Lots of people do. I just trust other people to retweet whatever's funny or stupid from him. But I don't think I could manage. I don't think I could take it just following what he was doing. Okay. I said we were going to switch subjects. What are the most important things to follow in the maelstrom? Let's see. I don't think I could really make that decision for you. So instead, I will jump around a little bit and give you a couple of different stories until one grabs my attention and forces me down that path. I've got a very long read that I want to share with you, but I need, I'll need more time than we've got today for it. I almost was able to convince myself to lock myself up in a room somewhere and read it to you for a Monday show, but it turns out that it just wasn't very well protected for sound there either. Plus, it was pretty hot in there. Okay, so what other things should you be aware of? Okay, first of all, I thought this was an interesting observation that I picked up via Twitter from Jennifer Bendry over at the Huffington Post on the Jeff Sessions nomination. Jeff Sessions, as you'll recall, initially omitted from his questionnaires that he submits to the Judiciary Committee in connection with his nomination as Attorney General. You'll recall that the news that he eliminated the notation that he had in fact been nominated for a federal judgeship and had at some point in the 80s been rejected as too racist. He just left that out. I can understand that, but as it turns out, one, there's more that he did not include in his disclosures, and two, this poses a particular problem for him rhetorically. Jeff Sessions omits decades of records, it now says, for his AG confirmation hearing, and guess what? The subtitle says it all. He once argued that doing this is a felony. Really? Jennifer explains this one. President-elect Donald Trump's pick for Attorney General Jeff Sessions is withholding decades' worth of records from his career ahead of Senate confirmation hearings early next month, according to an exhaustive report issued Friday by progressive advocacy groups. The next month would be January, Friday, of course, being part of 2016. The groups, which include Alliance for Justice and People for the American Way, reviewed the questionnaire that Sessions filled out for the Senate Judiciary Committee. It requires complete documentation of employment history, published writings, interviews and speeches, among many other things, and found astonishingly deficient responses. By the way, I don't even know how somebody who has been in the Senate for as long as Sessions, and he isn't even one of the longer-serving senators, how do you provide a complete history of interviews and speeches? I mean, I guess at that level you have a communications aide log everything, but man, what a task. But I guess that's what you pay people for. Anyway, he apparently provided astonishingly deficient responses to this questionnaire. He left out major details from his years as U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Alabama from 1981 to 1993, as Attorney General of Alabama from 1995 to 1997, and his first term in the U.S. Senate, 97 to 2002. The gaps encompass the time, for example, when Sessions was nominated to be a federal judge and then rejected after being deemed too racist. That time, by the way, 1986. He also omitted dozens of recent interviews, some of which include controversial statements he made. An October interview in which Sessions gave Trump a pass for making sexist comments because, quote, everybody knows that Trump likes women, unquote, and, quote, uses this kind of talk, unquote. That not cited in his questionnaire. And then a December 2015 interview in which Sessions says the predictions aren't coming true about climate change having disastrous effects is also not mentioned. The Trump transition team spokesperson did not respond to a request for comment, nor did a Senate spokesman for Sessions. How do they do it? Ironically, Sessions, who is currently a U.S. Senator from Alabama and a member of the Judiciary Committee, has chided previous nominees for failing to provide the committee with a full account of their backgrounds. Check this out. I want to share a concern that I do have about Judge Sotomayor's answers to the Senate Judiciary Standard Questionnaire, Sessions said in a June 2009 hearing on the then Supreme Court nominee Sonia Sotomayor. It is still incomplete. I know the administration was very proud to dump a lot of records out in what they call record time, but here, 2 weeks later, we still have some serious gaps in those answers to the committee questions. In April of 2010, Sessions spearheaded a letter to then committee chairman Patrick Leahy of Vermont, torching one of President Barack Obama's judicial nominees, Goodwin Liu, for not citing certain articles and events in his questionnaire. At best, he said, this nominee's extraordinary disregard for the committee's constitutional role demonstrates incompetence. At worst, it creates the impression that he knowingly attempted to hide his most controversial work from the committee. Reads the letter signed by Sessions and other Republicans. Professor Liu's unwillingness to take seriously his obligation to complete these basic forms is potentially disqualifying and has placed his nomination in jeopardy. A couple days later, Sessions warned that Liu might be breaking the law by leaving information out of his questionnaire. As a prosecutor, Title 18, Section 1001 makes it a criminal offense to make a false statement to the government. 2 years in jail, a felony, Sessions probably said in a slightly different accent. In April 15th, 2010 committee hearing, this is a certification that these nominees make that it is true and corrected, it says corrected rather than true and correct, and witnessed by a notary public. A judge who finds that a nominee or someone coming before him left out 117 or now 130 or 140 documents would consider contemplating, I guess, the possibility of criminal charges. I don't know. All right, well, there you go. Democrats say the gap in Sessions' record means Republicans should delay his hearing and give him more time to produce documents. His nomination package is still nowhere near ready for prime time, and it's hypocritical that he so frequently slammed past nominees for submitting incomplete documents only to do the same thing himself, said Nan Aaron of the Alliance for Justice. So, why not just slow down, give everyone the time they need to find everything and review everything, and not rush this really critical nomination through without allowing for due diligence? That's not going to happen, though. Senators in both parties regularly call for delays in hearings for nominees put forward by a president of the opposing party, and their calls go nowhere. It's one thing if only Democrats, being in the minority, can try to do is it's only one thing that they can do is try to slow down the confirmation of a nominee they don't support. Doesn't mean Sessions won't have to answer for the holes in his record during his confirmation hearing, which is scheduled for January 10th. Senator Dianne Feinstein of California, the new ranking Dem on the committee for the coming Congress, has already indicated she's not happy about his incomplete responses to the committee questionnaire, but that's neither here nor there. She's not happy. Big deal. And by the way, I understand why they do it, and it's traditionally been the case that they give a pass to this, but having January 10th hearings for a nominee to the Attorney General's office for a nomination that can't possibly have been made yet, because the incoming president who says he's going to make that nomination has not been inaugurated as president and can't send the message of nomination to the Senate yet. They should just delay things based on that. But traditionally, everybody knows who's going to be the nominee, and for presidents, both Republican and Democratic, they have in the past overlooked that, although they will not have the confirmation vote until January 20th. They have the hearings ahead of time so that they can be prepared to install the key cabinet positions, usually on the same day as the inauguration. The Senate retires from the inauguration ceremonies and spends the afternoon confirming key cabinet positions so that there's a cabinet in place to manage things. I don't know whether that's more important for the Trump administration or less important. Will he listen to his cabinet? Or are they extraordinarily important people? Because, we always make the excuse, well, if you put an incompetent boob in as president, don't worry about it, because he'll surround himself with smart, competent people to compensate, and they'll really run the presidency. We're often reassured. Except he is putting equally incompetent boobs in his cabinet. So I'm not, plus there's no indication he plans to listen to anybody. So I'm torn between whether Democrats should simply delay all the, politically speaking, I think what they want to do is delay everything that they can, including the nominations to the cabinet and sub-cabinet positions. On the other hand, I don't know how long you want to leave Donald Trump there alone. On the other hand, I don't know how quickly you want to surround him with these voices. Donald Trump is unusually subject to going with the last advice he hears on the way out the door. So who knows? You send him a cabinet, and who knows what kind of agenda they're going to implement. It's hard to read what to do with this guy. Anyway, I just thought that was an interesting one. So Jeff Sessions, when everybody else has those gaps, he's threatening prosecution or hinting darkly that there ought to be a prosecution. When it happens to him, gee whiz, golly gee, just an oversight, please ignore. And, his friends on the Republican side will, and they hold the majority, and that's that. Let's see, more discussion over the last couple of days as well of Trump's palace guard, as they put it, over at CNN. You'll recall Trump's plan to continue the use of private personal security guards over and above the Secret Service protection that he's getting, and then trying to work out somehow coordinating the jobs between the two. But it poses enormous problems legally, as well as for the logistics of actually protecting Donald Trump, which I will say this, if you want to have that kind of conflict and you would like to create a physical impediment to providing Donald Trump as president of the United States with a continuous and uninterrupted and world-class, as he would undoubtedly say, physical web of protection, I'm okay with that. You want to do it that way? I'll say this. Okay. Fine. Normally, I'm a little more concerned about the physical protection of the President of the United States. But Donald says no. He wants to do it his own way, and you got to let him have his way. If the guy gets assassinated, I'm sure he'll take personal responsibility for it himself on his way out. And, I'm not wishing the guy's assassination. I'm just saying he's a willful guy. And it may work out that way. I don't know. It's extraordinarily dangerous, it seems to me. John Michaels, who is writing the report for CNN here, has an interesting take on this stuff, I thought. By the way, did they describe his background at all? But he brought up some interesting points. Yes, here we are. He is a professor of law at the UCLA School of Law, where he teaches and writes about administrative law, national security law, privatization, and the separation of powers. It's a good collection of skills for this particular article. He's currently working on a book, by the way, tentatively titled Still No Angels, America's Enduring Commitment to Separation of Powers from Madison to FDR to Trump, forthcoming from Harvard University Press, who has paid me nothing for that promotional plug. By the way, it says, unless otherwise noted below, facts reflect research for his scholarly projects. The views expressed in this commentary are his own. What are they? Reports are swirling over President-elect Donald Trump's apparent decision to bring a private security detail with him to the White House. Given America's checkered experience with private military forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, Trump's anti-government rhetoric, and his apparent comfort with commingling state and commercial power, the last thing we need is a Blackwater on the Potomac. Though the analogy to Blackwater is hardly perfect, we do have a recent and sordid history of private security contractors advancing sensitive government responsibilities. The number of contractors deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan often rivaled the number of uniformed military personnel. Many served admirably, and quite a few paid the ultimate price for their service. Still, trouble abounded. Often, the contractors weren't as well trained. They weren't as sensitive to the communities they were policing, and they weren't as scrupulous when it came to the laws, practices, and customs of civilized military engagement. It is therefore not surprising that allegations of criminal and civil misconduct attached to many of the biggest contractors, and that U.S.-backed governments in Kabul and Baghdad regularly pleaded with the State Department to rein these contractors in. Trump's palace guard is a bad idea for a variety of cultural, operational, and legal reasons. Culturally speaking, a private security force further broadcasts Trump's mistrust of the government he's been elected to lead. The U.S. Secret Service remains the envy of governments around the world. Headline-grabbing scandals aside, its personnel are the best of the best, and the office has a long-standing reputation for professional excellence. Yet suddenly, they're not good enough? This doesn't make sense, unless you already harbor profound doubts and distrust of the federal government, as Trump seemingly does. Marginalizing the Secret Service constitutes yet another battle in Trump's apparent war against Washington. His message is clear: we should not trust the feds. This campaign of delegitimization, recall his repeated promises to drain the swamp and his insistence that the system is rigged, will no doubt come in handy whenever federal officials challenge the incoming administration on everything from climate change denial to conflicts of interest to the coziness with the Kremlin. Operationally, when it comes to protecting a president, there is just no way private security guards can bring to the table what the Secret Service does. They aren't just the best security detail, they're also the best at balancing the competing demands of serving a particular president and the presidency. Maintaining that balance is critical to the project of American constitutional government. We are, as Abraham Lincoln reminds us, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Such a reminder is particularly important today, as the president-elect indicates a desire to remain somewhat involved in his business interests and expresses a particularly low tolerance for dissent and criticism. The Secret Service cannot and will not be enablers of these decidedly unpresidential predilections. The same cannot be said of private contractors. It has already been well documented that Trump's security detail conceives of its role very differently from that of the Secret Service. Its members are campaign boosters, partisan combatants, and confidants to a celebrity businessman who is about to be president. Even assuming these aides were as well trained and as well integrated into the larger world of federal law enforcement, diplomacy, and intelligence agencies, they represent themselves as approaching their responsibilities and loyalties very differently. Finally, having a private security force for the president-elect raises thorny legal issues. A private security detail paid for by, I suppose, the Trump organization, the president-elect himself, or some wealthy donors may sound appealing to those clamoring for lower taxes and greater fiscal responsibility, but it is a problem. Congress appropriates funds to the executive branch with the expectation that those will be the only funds spent. Indeed, one of the provisions of the Anti-Deficiency Act prohibits government officials from employing voluntary labor or drawing on alternative funding sources to support an unauthorized supplemental workforce. This restriction on out-of-pocket spending is important because it ensures Congress retains complete control over the government's purse strings as the Constitution requires. I'll editorialize a little bit here. Don't forget that this wouldn't necessarily have to be an arrangement that ends with his private security. Suppose members or the career employees of the Department of Justice refuse to carry out some clearly unconstitutional and illegal orders of the Attorney General or President. And he simply says, I'll just bring in temps to do it. And I'll pay them myself. No cost to the government. Therefore, you have no complaint about these things. Well, we actually do. You're not authorized to do that stuff. You can't just bring in other bodies to do it. They have to be hired and vetted and matriculate to the jobs through a certain process that ensures that it's the government being served, not the commander. You see what I mean? So it doesn't have to just be about his personal security. He could do this anywhere if this is allowed to stand. The restriction against out-of-pocket spending, like we said, is important because it ensures Congress retains complete control of the government's purse strings as the Constitution requires. It also keeps the size of government in check, preserving our constitutional system of checks and balances. Absent this restriction, the president could hire a phalanx of support staff to do more or different work than what Congress authorized, thereby creating fiefdoms, or some people say fiefdoms, we'll say, of unchecked, unrivaled bureaucratic power. I'll just hire myself a different Department of Justice. Congressional appropriations dictate the size and scope of executive activity. Imagine, for instance, a Congress concerned that a presidential administration might go to extremes in enforcing federal immigration law. That Congress might intentionally restrict funding available to the Department of Homeland Security, limiting the latter's enforcement capabilities. Now imagine an independently wealthy Homeland Security chief committed to the zealous enforcement of immigration laws. Were that chief permitted to draw upon his or her personal fortune to hire hundreds of additional immigration agents, they just go with the she. She would be thumbing her nose at Congress and the federal appropriations power. Such developments should be especially alarming to those most taken by the Trump messaging. Circumvention of the Anti-Deficiency Act, nobody mentioned, of course, in the campaign. Why would they? Opens the door to truly big, scary, and unaccountable federal power. It invites a certain plutocratic tribalism, warlordism, I'd say, where loyalties run to benefactors in and out of government, and where Congress loses control over the shape, reach, and complexion of the government. At the end of the day, we might conclude that the private security detail itself isn't that big of a deal. It satisfies the president-elect's princely pretensions and gives him an excuse to keep his buddies close by. But make no mistake, there is much at stake when it comes to tolerating such a detail. Acquiescence signals a willingness to credit arguments that an elite federal institution such as the Secret Service is unreliable, that armed contractors acting somewhat under the color of law are acceptable, and that self-funded bureaucratic fiefdoms insulated from congressional control are anything but constitutionally offensive. And here endeth the article, and almost the show as well. Good points being made, things we need to add to this. In addition to the operational safety problems, what about operational safety problems that kind of run the other way? The Secret Service is supposed to be okay with the idea of private contractors, but who gets to decide who gets hired as a private contractor? Is there a vetting situation here? Does Donald Trump do it? is the Secret Service in on it? And if not, because why would they be? It's private, right? Basically, you're saying, I mean, I know Donald Trump probably feels like he can trust those guys, but the Secret Service is being asked to just accept an unvetted parade of heavily armed men to basically enter the president's personal space whenever he feels like it, they feel like it, or whatever. And how are they supposed to know whose direction are they supposed to take on these things? Trust us. Donald doesn't know exactly what's good for him, but he trusts us to make these decisions. I need to hear this from the president. You're going to carry your gun into his office? I don't know who you are. Well, I got a little card that says I work for these guys. No, that's not the way it works here with the Secret Service. You don't get to just waltz into his office with a gun. Don't worry about it. He knows me. You know what? No. But they're going to have these fights. These things are going to happen. Not to mention, I don't know. We'll talk about this a little bit tomorrow. I wanted to maybe think about getting to this today, but David K. Johnston, as a matter of fact, circulated a tweet on Twitter. Let me share it with you anyway. A picture of him from his New Year's Eve party. We were all busy looking at pictures of him from his New Year's Eve party with Joe Scarborough, because Joe Scarborough had just indignantly insisted that he wasn't at that New Year's Eve party, but now he's been photographed there. Interesting development all by itself. But a picture of him at the New Year's Eve party with our good friend from this show, that is, we've mentioned him before and had a laugh at his expense, Joey No Socks Cinque. Joe Cinque from the, American Academy of Hospitality Sciences. You remember this goofball? Don't forget, though, that he's a mob-associated guy. I'm sure on the periphery and everything, but he's a felon, an art thief, no less, and maybe somebody who shouldn't be hanging out with the president-elect of the United States at the New Year's Eve party, but he's still there. He remains loyal to him. That's admirable, whatever. But basically, we're now saying, what, private security, private contractors, this, that, and the other thing, puppet, no puppet, you're the puppet. Putin controls him. He may be mob connected. What if the guys who end up as his private contractors what if they're Russian, for one thing? Those are tough guys, right? Maybe they want to work in law enforcement, too. You imagine he ends up with private security, that they're a mix of Russians and mob enforcers with an administration like this so subject to corruption, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, not only is Donald Trump going to continue the gravy train for himself, but for all of us, too. And we'll make sure he does, because if he doesn't, we'll remind him that his personal protection that has a permanent pass from the Secret Service to enter his presence with guns is really a bunch of Russian mob enforcers. Can you imagine such a thing? I can, and that's what's so crazy about it. The guy's going to be president. What are we going to do? I don't know. Maybe we should just let him get rubbed out. All right. Well, it'll all work itself out in the end, I'm sure, as will your consumption of the news, because you're going to stay tuned all damn day long to Netroots Radio, which means you're listening to the after show coming up next, and they will bring you the following and more. Trump advisor Kellyanne Conway says the OCE has been overzealous in investigating consumer complaints. Interesting term. Trump is leaning toward ex-governor of Georgia, Sonny Perdue, for agriculture secretary. And Facebook censors an Italian art historian's page because her photograph of a nude 16th
From
century
Daily
statue.
Coons Radio on netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Those Italian art historians always photographing the nude statues. But hey, that's a part of Renaissance art, is it not? And of course, it's a statue of the god Neptune in the heart of Bologna, Italy. And apparently that violates Facebook's terms of use. They really have to straighten this stuff out. Amazing what they get confused over. All that and more on the After Show with Wink and Justice next.